welcome back to another episode of Sustainability Uncovered. I'm your host, Neve, the part-time Environmental and Sustainability Officer at UPSU. I'm here today with my co-host again, Kelsey Parson. So today we're discussing the impacts of glacial melting on people and the environment. I'm here today with our guest, Dr. Caroline Clason. She's the Associate Professor of Glaciology at the university. Hi Caroline.
Hi, nice to be here.
Thank you for being here today. So, just out of curiosity, for students that don't know you, what's the main focus of your work?
I'm a glaciologist. So what I study is how glaciers respond to climate change. But more specifically than that, I'm really interested in the water that glaciers produce. So they produce something we call meltwater. And what I study is how much of that is produced over time, where it goes, how it flows through the system, and also the quality of the water. So it's not just how much water is produced, but also whether or not that's full of sediment or even contains contaminants that might be problematic for people downstream.
From if the glacier is melting, what are the implications of this to people and the environment?
So the main impacts of melting glaciers, the big one that everyone's heard of is, of course, sea level rise. And that is a huge issue, particularly over sort of the medium to long term. But in the shorter term, the main impacts are really on water resources for drinking water and for sanitation. So very much fitting into sustainable development and ensuring that people have access to a good supply of fresh water. That also links to food production, so how crops can be irrigated. A lot of that is done through glacial meltwater in places like the Andes and the Himalayas. And even things like energy production that people maybe don't think about. But in Peru, for example, about half of the country's electricity is produced from hydropower, which is fantastic. It's great. A lot of countries don't have such a high proportion of renewable energy. However, the water that's needed to produce that energy is reliant on a supply of meltwater from the glaciers in the Andes, and those are shrinking. So basically, the impacts of melting glaciers, aside from sea level rise, the things to me that I focus on are very much on water security and food security and energy security related to that.
All of these impacts obviously affects us as a people. Can you just expand a bit more on that, like food security, water security, how that just affects humans?
Yeah, so when we think about the number of people that are reliant on glacier melt, we're talking about literally millions and millions of people, especially if you think about some of the really large river basins that are fed from the Himalayas. So the Indus and the Ganges, for example, really massive populations downstream of that. So it's not just that a few people are reliant on glacier meltwater, there's actually millions of people. Quite a large proportion of the Earth's population is directly reliant, particularly in South America and in Asia. So realistically, it's important not just because people need water and food, but it's actually important just to try and avoid poverty, to try and keep people healthy, to give them access to fresh water that can be used for sanitation, good quality water as well, super important. So yeah, it's really important for people, not just also from a sort of health and environment perspective, but even also from a sort of socio-cultural perspective too. Some groups who live maybe in close proximity to mountain glaciers, or perhaps Inuit and Sami that live close to the pole in the north, they have a strong cultural link with glaciers and cold environments as landscapes. So the decline of those landscapes also has important consequences for how people go about their day-to-day lives, not just in terms of the economy and their livelihoods, but also just how they interact with where they live. So these are concerns that maybe haven't really been picked up as much as they should be, how it just impacts how people live.
What challenges would you say you have faced while taking on this research and doing this work?
So most recently, the obvious answer to that is COVID. And, I think we're all experiencing challenges related to COVID, aren't we? Specifically for me and the people that I work with, this has really impacted how we can do our research because we can't do field work at the moment. So over the last year, I should have been in the Peruvian Andes last April, but our field trip was cancelled with, I think, 2 weeks' notice, because that's just when the first lockdown came in. I should have been in Greenland in the summer doing research on contaminants in glacial meltwater there. I couldn't do that either. And while we're working really closely with other researchers in Peru for our research project there, even they haven't been able to access the field in the same way that they normally would, because of course COVID impacts everyone. So they can do some stuff on our behalf, but not everything, because it's not safe for them to do. So they can't go out and speak to the local community in the same way they normally would. And we certainly can't access the field. So it has been a big challenge, and one that I hope will get better over the coming months for all of us, so that we can start doing that again. I think the other challenge that I've faced more personally with my work is just actually being a female glaciologist is quite a challenge. It's a field of research that is predominantly male, at least historically. It's got links to sort of polar exploration and, the race to Antarctica and going up Everest and all of these things. Decades or maybe even more than a century ago, it's very much this link between exploration and science. And in glaciology, that persisted maybe longer than it did in some other subjects. So although that's changed very much for the better in recent years, there's still not a gender balance between men and women in glaciology. So being a sort of female research lead or running a field program, in remote environments that are really challenging, sometimes it can be difficult as a female. But I think I have overcome those challenges, which is good. It hasn't put me off, and I'm lucky to have a group that I work with at Plymouth who are very much balanced in terms of gender and background and everything, which is great, and I can see that pattern in lots of other places too. So definitely a positive way to move forward.
No, most definitely. It is very inspiring to any people that want to go into a field that's highly dominated by males and have the confidence to be able to do so. You did talk a little about COVID and the implications of that. Do you think that will have long-term effects, or is this just a short-term thing, like a temporary blip in your research or anything such as that?
Yeah, I think I would love to say it is a temporary blip. I suspect there will be impacts directly on our ability to do research probably over the next year at least, although we are very much hoping to get out to Greenland this summer and the Andes in the autumn. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But I also think actually in the longer term, one thing that is maybe a positive in some ways, it makes people think about whether they need to travel or not. And I think from a sustainability perspective, that can only be a positive thing. So I know that myself and the people that I work with in the research group at Plymouth, we are thinking about how many of us need to travel when we can again. Do we need to actually attend international conferences in person, or can we continue to do some of this virtually as we have been doing over the last year? So in some ways, I think it's caused researchers to maybe rethink how we can do things so that reliance on international travel isn't quite as large as it used to be. So, but there are some things that virtual stuff just can't replace. Like there is no replacement for getting into the field and collecting samples and doing your analysis. So I personally can't wait to be able to do that again, but while being sensible about our carbon footprint as well.
Yeah, definitely. I don't imagine you can really take samples via a Zoom meeting in the Andes.
No. No. But we do have fantastic colleagues in Peru who have, when they've been able to, within the limits of COVID, they have been able to do some sampling for us, but that can only go so far as well, and everyone has different areas of expertise and different experience of working in the landscape. So we can overcome it to some extent by having fantastic international collaborations. It's great to be able to work together in the field too. So
the implications caused by glacial melting and all the food security and energy security and water security, do you think there's a big enough emphasis on this in the public sphere, people knowing about this? Because I know it's heavily emphasised about sea level rise, but the other implications caused by that as such, do you think?
I think there's still a bias towards the big stuff, so sea level rise, quite rightly, has been at the top of the agenda in terms of glaciology and the IPCC and things like this. But in the media, I think there's a tendency to focus on that a lot more than on the pressing issues of actually what we have in terms of problems right now. And water resources are a problem right now. So there's this concept, it's called peak water. And what it means essentially is that glaciers eventually run out of meltwater. So that's essentially what we're trying to model or predict in the future. So peak water, if we imagine a glacier, and we know that the temperature is getting warmer, the climate's warming, and that glacier melts more and more and more over time in response to that warming climate. And as it does that, it actually produces more meltwater. So for a short period, people downstream might actually get a larger amount of water resource. But at some point, that glacier becomes so small that no matter how much it melts, there isn't enough water being produced. So it starts to shrink, and then that reaches what we call peak water. So from that point onwards, the water resources decline. Now, that's already happened, we think, in South America. So the glaciers in South America have retreated enough that peak water might have already passed, so that actually the people there are having to already adapt to potential decline in water resource availability. In the European Alps, we're probably facing peak water around about now, so that we're in that situation at the moment. And then look into the east in the Himalaya, because of the different properties of the glaciers there and the different climate systems, we think peak water will happen a little bit into the future. And that gives us a bit of time to learn lessons from what we know about how people have had to adapt and how things have changed in South America, for example, and think about how we can actually put in place some mitigation and adaptation strategies in the Himalaya, where there are so many people relying on glacier meltwater, for when that happens in the future. So I think there should be a bigger emphasis on this and how that's communicated to the public and also to policymakers too, because it's an issue that's very much current, not just a case of future predictions. It's actually something that impacts people just now.
Yeah, definitely. You talked about how people had to adapt in South America. What have they actually done to adapt in these regions where they don't have enough water from the glacial melt?
So in Peru, for example, glacier melt contributes about 40% of annual runoff to this one particular catchment in the Andes that we work in. But in the dry season, in periods of drought in particular, that can be as much as 90%. So it's a huge amount of the water that they rely on. And also things like El Nino are really important in the Andes region too. So that sort of compounds that issue. So people there are really just starting to think about what they can do. We are considering things like payment for ecosystem services to make people consider how they can use natural resources and who's responsible for them, how we abstract them in a sustainable way, and whether or not that's something that should actually be almost like a commodity to make sure it's used in a fair and equitable manner. But also there's some fantastic traditional knowledge in Peru that feeds back, back to the Inca thousands and thousands of years ago. They made use of terracing of the soil a long time ago when it came to producing crops. And actually some people still use terracing on the land as a way to farm in an efficient manner and to allow irrigation in an efficient manner. The Inca also used canals to move water around the landscape too. So that's something that's considered. But actually one of the big things that people are looking at, or at least experimenting on at the moment, is trying to develop new wetlands, because wetlands are basically a sponge for water, and then they release the water slowly downstream. So by introducing more wetlands back into the environment, the water can be slowed down. So if there's any rainfall or melt, it can be slowed down in its path through the landscape. And that's one way to try and sort of mitigate against immediate changes to glacial meltwater production, by just slowing down how fast that water trickles downstream. So there's some lessons to be learned both from sort of traditional knowledge and technologies that have been used a long time, but also more modern approaches to that. Of course, just things like being able to farm in an efficient way, like modern technologies that actually use water efficiently in terms of irrigation systems, and being sustainable about how much is produced as well, ensuring that it's not just the people upstream or downstream that benefit, but that everyone in a catchment can benefit.
Yeah, definitely. Just you spoke about wetlands and building new ones. How would they, for people that wouldn't know, how do they go about doing that?
So it's something that's very much got to be supported by, it could be by NGOs or by local research institutes. And in some regions that can be challenging because people have a bit of a distrust of the local government, for example. In some regions of the world, corruption's an issue, so people don't trust a lot of the initiatives that maybe the government puts in place. So by working with NGOs and non-governmental research institutes, I think that can help to improve public trust in some of the strategies that we put in place. So I'm working on a project at the moment that's trying to look at adaptation and mitigation and what could we do? What happens if we change this type of farming to something else? What happens if we increase vegetation cover in this part of the land? Does that change how water and sediment moves through the system? And there are other projects in the UK that are sort of complementary to what I'm doing. One of them is actually focused on wetland production and how that incorporates into the system. Not just how it slows down water, but also how it cleans the water too. Wetlands have this fantastic ability to actually clean the water that goes through them. And in the Andes, some of the local geology in the Andes, it's got lots of iron and also pyrite, fills gold. And that causes the water to become more acidic as it interacts with those minerals, to the extent it's undrinkable. You know, we're talking like sort of pH 3 kind of level. So really quite acidic, like you would not want to drink it. But what they find is once that water's moved through our wetland system, they call it bodegadas in Peru, once it moves through, the water downstream is neutral again. So it has this fantastic capability to clean the water as well, which is really cool. It's beneficial for the local ecology, for the wildlife to develop these new ecosystems, but also it has benefits for people in the landscape too. So yeah, it's just a really nice example of how we can do something that's actually beneficial for the environment, at least if you do it in the right way, while being beneficial for people too. So it is possible to come up with strategies that are good for everyone.
That sounds honestly amazing. I didn't realise that wetlands could do that, but yeah, that sounds like a really good way, like to sustainably get people to have water and meet some of the sustainability goals. I say it's too late to address the current issues that cause glacier retreat and having not enough water melting. Do you think it's too late now to address that, like lowering our carbon footprint and stuff like that, or do you think there's something that still can be done?
I think it's a difficult question. I think if we think about just mountain glaciers, I would say that unfortunately we're on the wrong path at the moment. And even if we kept emissions much, much lower than they are now, there would still, for a period of time, the glaciers would still respond, the climate would still respond to what we've already put into the atmosphere. So no matter how well we do in the next few years, there will still be a period of time that they'll retreat in response to that. If we go along the pathway of RCP 8.5, which is one of the worst emissions pathways predicted in the IPCC, then we'd expect mountain glaciers, certainly in the Alps, to be pretty much gone by the end of the century. But what I would stress is that we don't think we are going to follow that emissions pathway. That's a sort of extreme end member scenario. And I very much hope that we will find solutions internationally to stop us being on that path. But I think there will be retreat of glaciers, even if they don't disappear. I think that's unavoidable. The ice sheets, if we think about sea level rise contributions, Greenland and Antarctica for the moment are much more stable than the mountain glaciers are. They actually contribute less to sea level rise than mountain glaciers do currently, but they have the ability to contribute an awful lot more meters of sea level rise if they were to disappear. But on thinking about the current pathway we're on, Greenland and Antarctica are relatively safe at the moment, relatively stable. So I think it really is, certainly over the next few decades, mountain glaciers are probably the biggest challenge with respect to sustainability and people having to adapt to a changing environment.
Yeah, I agree. I think most people automatically, when they think of glaciers, they go straight to the ice sheets instead of the mountains. How do you think students can get involved in the sense of mitigating these issues or raising awareness for these issues?
So one thing I really enjoy, and I've had a project recently doing this, is citizen science. I really feel like that's a good way forward to help people to understand like actually what some of the important issues are now. So one of the things that myself and some of the researchers I work with, we've had a project called Glacier Map recently, which is satellite imagery that anyone from the public can go and map the outline of a glacier in the Andes from 2 different years, so from 1984 and 2018. And then they can see the difference between the outline that they've drawn between one year and the next. And we also, by doing this, conducted a survey to see if it impacted how people understood glacier retreat, whether it changed how they thought about it. So that's one thing that we've done as researchers, and we've had a lot of students, both school-age students, but also university students and other glaciologists, other members of the public. We had about 550 responses to that. So those have been fantastic contributions directly, not just to helping us understand how glaciers have changed in the region through mapping them, but actually then allowing people to understand more about that too. So I think being engaged in opportunities like that, any citizen science engagement that's possible, through speaking about it via the right channels as well. And I think also like feeding into social media communication that eventually drips down sometimes to larger media outlets, national and international outlets. Occasionally you do see fantastic articles in the news now. The New York Times sometimes does these really fantastic interactive sort of articles where you can go down and it changes, and it's just a really cool graphical interface. And they've done a couple of really good ones recently on glacier change and relation to water resources. So I am seeing in some areas a slight shift in the focus of news outlets, but I think we as a public can do more just to speak about that on the platforms that we have, really.
I also read an article on BBC like a couple of days ago about glacier change, and it's just like it came up. It's been coming up a bit more recently. Hasn't been like, oh yeah, look, one couple months down the line, oh look, next one's a bit more frequent. I think that's really good. I think it's also like social media is a big thing, and I think students don't really use the platform that they have sometimes. And I feel like if we get more involved in that, it would hopefully, make the shift a bit quicker in like the conversations that are happening.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that's been in the news recently, you might have seen this. There was a sort of hazard event that happened in India recently in the Himalaya. Basically, there was a landslide that mixed with snow and ice onto a glacier, and it propagated downstream down this river valley where they were producing a hydropower plant as well. It hadn't been finished yet, and it caused massive flooding in the river downstream because there was just so much material from the landslide and from the bit of the glacier that essentially caused to fall off. That just all mixed with the water in the river, and it caused this huge flood downstream, and unfortunately killed quite a large number of people. And I think when these large events happen, you do see this rise in media attention, quite rightly, because people have lost their lives there. But I think that particular news story seemed quite poignant for me, because the reason people were in that valley was they were creating a hydropower scheme to create green energy related to glacier melt, and in response to the fact that there are changing needs on water resources, there's growing population, food production is becoming more and more stressed. As we grow as a population, we need to produce more food under a warming climate, under potentially drier conditions. It's all just this really large challenge. So it seemed like it was just one of those really unfortunate things where people were obviously trying to respond to the need to produce power, but because of the warming climate, these one-off events, these glacier-related hazards, may become more frequent in the future too, and because they become more unstable. The ice is more unstable, the lakes in front of the glaciers are more unstable, and also mountain permafrost is more unstable, that can lead to more landslides too. So all of these things are potentially something that we're going to have to deal with more in the future. I think it's good that the media does pick up on this, and I hope that in that case it wasn't just okay, let's report it and then forget about it. I hope that people can learn lessons from that in terms of keeping people safe, but also in how we adapt to that changing environment and the hazards that it can pose as well.
Yeah. I agree. What would you say are the key points that people should take away from this talk?
There are probably three that I would focus on. The first one is that I hope that people realise that glacier retreat isn't just an issue about how the landscape looks. Sometimes we see these pictures of, a glacier in the Alps and how it looked 40 years ago and how it looks now. Everyone's seen these images. And maybe people don't associate that with actually what it means on the ground, what it means for ecosystems, what it means for people. They just think, okay, the landscape is changing. But I think I would like to see that people realise that actually has direct and sometimes quite serious consequences, not just for a small population, but for quite a large proportion of the world's population, both in terms of sea level rise and water resources. I'd also say that we do have a responsibility to keep emissions as low as possible. But also, in addition to that, we can do what we can there, and that's very much over to governments to really drive that. But also on a slightly more decentralised level, we can think about developing more sustainable practices to how we produce food, how we produce energy, and how we adapt to changing water supplies, not just from glaciers, but actually from all different types of environmental systems, areas that face drought, areas where rivers are heavily modified because they're prone to flooding. There are lots and lots of issues related to water supply across the world, and I think we need to be more clever in how we sort of adapt to changes and how we use those systems. And I think also that I hope that people realise that the actions of what we might do in a country that doesn't have glaciers, we might think we're a world apart from where they are, but what we do here can be felt by people on the other side of the world. How what we put into the air, both in terms of carbon emissions and related to climate, but also contaminants. So I also look at contaminants from radionuclides from nuclear accidents, to heavy metals, to black carbon from forest fires and car emissions. All of these things, they end up on the glaciers too, and can actually pollute waterways when meltwater is produced. So I think people need to remember that what we do here can have quite a large impact on ecosystems and people, even at the North Pole. Really, we're finding, I know that a range of contaminants have been found in the most surprising places that you would just think of as being pristine. So I think that's something else that I would like people to take away from it.
Yeah, definitely. We asked this to all our guests that come onto the podcast, and we were wondering, how does your work at Plymouth Uni and your research fit in with the wider UN sustainability goals?
So I think for me, probably the main two would be climate action. That's a big one. That's very much on all of us. But clean water and sanitation as well. I think previously I've worked as a glaciologist for a while now, and actually initially I started out working on the ice sheets. So I was interested in how meltwater moved through the Greenland ice sheet. And it was really interesting. I got to go to Greenland. I had a fantastic time. Really interesting project, and it is important. However, I always felt a bit disconnected from people and the impact it had on people, whereas the research I'm doing now is much more focused on water quantity and quality and what that actually means for people on the ground. So for me, clean water and sanitation has become one of the key things that I focus on in my research, and just that being available, and reliable, to not just having a sort of boom and bust supply, but how we can think of ways to make that water supply reliable. And that, when we think about that food, water and energy security, what we call the nexus, how they link to one another, that of course then impacts things like the zero hunger goal and affordable and clean energy too. But also, maybe to a lesser extent, or maybe not, life on land and life on underwater, both really important, both not just in terms of humans, but the ecosystems around us as well. Glacier habitats are quite unique habitats in the world, and they support quite unique and quite narrow groups of species that require certain conditions to flourish. So as that changes, as those environments become deglaciated and become warmer, the species in those environments have to adapt to that too. So all of these goals, I think, are quite central to the work I do.
Great, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. I'm sure the students will really appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you.